She took her sister's place to marry a dying millionaire. But then everything changed. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. It was late in the evening when Emily sat alone in the dimly lit kitchen of her small apartment. The ticking of the old clock on the wall sounded louder than usual, as if reminding her that time was running out. Bills were stacked on the counter, each one a reminder of how far behind she was. Her younger brother's tuition fee, her mother's medical expenses, and the constant threat of eviction pressed heavily on her shoulders. She clenched her fists, her eyes burning with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall. Emily was the kind of woman who endured storms silently, who carried the burdens of others without complaint. Her older sister, Vanessa, was everything Emily was not. Vanessa was glamorous, confident, and always knew how to draw attention. When Vanessa announced that she had been approached with an offer to marry a wealthy man who was said to be gravely ill, Emily was horrified. It sounded like a transaction, not a marriage. But Vanessa laughed it off, saying it was only for a short time, that the man did not have long to live, and that his wealth would secure her freedom. On the morning of the wedding, Emily stood at the church doors in a simple pale dress that she had borrowed. The air was heavy with the scent of roses and candle wax, but her sister was nowhere to be found. Panic rose in Emily's chest as the minutes ticked by. The groom's family was waiting, the guests were whispering, and the pressure was suffocating. Then Emily found the letter. Folded and tucked inside her sister's dressing table, the note was hurriedly written. "I cannot do this. I am sorry. I am leaving. Do not look for me." Her world tilted. Vanessa had vanished, abandoning the man she was supposed to marry, abandoning the deal, abandoning everything. Emily's heart pounded as she read the words again and again. If she walked away too, the scandal would destroy their family. Their mother's fragile health would not survive the shame. And the man waiting at the altar, the man who thought he was marrying Vanessa, would be humiliated in front of everyone. Emily's hands shook as she looked at her reflection in the mirror. She saw the face of a woman terrified, but also resolute. She thought of her brother's education, her mother's medicine, and the crushing debt that grew heavier with every passing day. She thought of the desperate need to protect what little dignity her family still had. Against every instinct in her body, Emily whispered to herself, "I will take her place." The sound of the wedding march began to echo through the church. The guests rose, the organ played, and Emily took a deep breath. Each step felt heavier than the last as she walked down the aisle, her pulse racing like a drumbeat in her ears. At the end of the aisle stood the groom, Alexander Blackwell, a man whispered about in every corner of the city. He was a self-made millionaire who had built an empire from nothing, but rumors said his health was failing. His face was striking, sharp, and unreadable. His eyes, however, held no warmth as they locked on her. He did not smile. He did not even blink. He simply watched her approach with a gaze that cut through her disguise. The contract was supposed to be simple, a marriage in name only, a union that would provide security for her family and company for a dying man. But as Emily reached the altar, clutching the bouquet with trembling hands, she realized that nothing about this moment was simple. The vows echoed in her mind as though they were chains binding her to a destiny she never chose. Her lips trembled as she repeated the words. Every sentence felt like a lie, yet each one sealed her fate. When the priest finally said, "You may now kiss the bride," Emily's heart thundered so violently that she thought it might give her away. Alexander leaned in, his lips brushing her cheek instead of her mouth, a cold and calculated move that sent a shiver down her spine. The guests clapped politely, but Emily could sense the tension in the air. The truth was hidden, yet fragile, like glass ready to shatter. Alexander's hand gripped hers firmly as they walked away from the altar together, but there was no tenderness in his touch. It was not the hand of a husband, it was the grip of a man who had questions, who did not trust, who was already suspicious. Emily forced a smile as flashes from cameras captured the moment. Inside, however, she was trembling. She had stepped into her sister's role, but at what cost? Every glance, every word, every silence from Alexander carried the weight of judgment. And though the ceremony was over, Emily felt that the real trial had just begun. That was the day she married a millionaire she barely knew, under a lie that could destroy them both. What Emily did not know was that this lie would not only change her life, but would awaken a love she never believed she deserved. And in the shadow of secrets, a battle for truth, dignity, and survival was about to unfold. Emily sat silently in the back seat of the limousine as it rolled away from the church. The white ribbon tied to the door handle fluttered in the wind, mocking the truth of the wedding that had just taken place. Her hands rested stiffly on her lap, the bouquet of roses already wilting under her grip. She tried to steady her breathing, but her chest tightened with every passing second. Beside her sat Alexander Blackwell, her new husband, though the word felt foreign and heavy on her tongue. Alexander did not look at her. His gaze was fixed outside the tinted window, jaw set, expression unreadable. The silence was suffocating, yet Emily could not bring herself to break it. She knew his reputation, the ruthless businessman who had clawed his way to fortune and power, the man whispered to have only months left to live. She had heard stories of his coldness, his sharp intelligence, and his refusal to trust anyone. Now, sitting only inches away, she could feel that icy aura radiating from him. Finally, his voice cut through the air like a blade. "You do not love me," he said flatly, not turning his head. "You did not marry me for romance. You married me for something else." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She clutched the bouquet tighter, praying he could not hear the tremor in her voice. I married you because it was arranged." Her answer was careful, controlled, but her pulse hammered in her ears. Alexander let out a short, humorless laugh. "Arranged? Yes, that is what they all say. A dying man with money is always a convenient arrangement." The sting of his words burned in her chest, but she stayed silent. She could not reveal her sister's betrayal. She could not reveal the letter, the truth, or the real reason she stood in that dress. To confess now would destroy everything. So Emily lowered her gaze, hiding the storm in her eyes, and said nothing. The car pulled up to the Blackwell estate, a sprawling mansion surrounded by iron gates and acres of manicured gardens. The sight alone was enough to remind Emily of the chasm between their worlds. She had grown up in a cramped apartment with peeling wallpaper and a leaky roof. Now she stood before marble columns, crystal chandeliers, and walls lined with portraits of ancestors who had built legacies she could never imagine. As they entered, staff lined the grand hallway, bowing respectfully. Their eyes lingered on her, curious, perhaps even suspicious. Emily forced herself to walk with steady steps, though her knees threatened to give way. Alexander dismissed the staff with a single wave of his hand, his authority unquestioned. Once alone, he turned to her, his gaze sharp. "Listen carefully," he said, his tone low but commanding. "This marriage may satisfy the public eye, but do not think for a moment that you have fooled me. I know women like you. You come with soft smiles and gentle hands, but underneath, there is always a hunger for wealth. I will not be your victim." Emily's lips parted, but no words came out. 100 protests rushed to her mind, how wrong he was, how much he misunderstood, but none could be spoken. To argue would only draw suspicion. To reveal her true identity would unravel everything. So she stood there, swallowing the ache in her throat, and whispered, "I am not here to hurt you." "Oh." For the first time, Alexander's eyes softened, but only for a fraction of a second. Then the mask returned, cold and unyielding. He stepped closer, close enough that Emily could see the faint lines of exhaustion etched across his face, the weariness hidden beneath his strength. "We will see," he said quietly, before turning away. That night, Emily lay awake in the vast bedroom that was now hers, though it felt nothing like home. The silence was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the ornate clock on the mantel. She stared at the ceiling, replaying every word, every glance, every accusation. Fear gripped her, but beneath it was something else, an ember of determination. She had made a choice, and she would see it through. Somewhere down the hall, Alexander coughed, a deep, rattling sound that echoed through the emptiness of the mansion. Emily rose from the bed instinctively, her feet carrying her toward the sound before she could even think. She found him seated in a leather chair by the window, shoulders tense, one hand pressed to his chest. For the first time, he looked vulnerable, fragile even. She hesitated at the door, unsure if he would push her away, but then she stepped forward. "You should not be sitting in the cold air," she said softly. "It will make your coughing worse." His eyes lifted to hers, surprised. For a moment, the sharpness faded, replaced by something she could not name. He did not answer. But he did not push her away, either. Emily fetched a blanket from the nearby couch and draped it gently over his shoulders. Her touch was light, careful, as though she feared he might shatter. He watched her closely, as if searching for the trick, the hidden motive. But all he saw was the quiet sincerity in her eyes. In that moment, Alexander Blackwell realized this woman was not what he had expected, and Emily, though trapped in a lie, felt the first crack in the walls between them. It was a fragile truce, unspoken and uncertain, but it was enough to plant the seed of something neither of them dared to name. The following morning, Emily awoke to the soft light of dawn streaming through the heavy velvet curtains. She had barely slept, her mind restless with the weight of secrets and the sting of Alexander's accusations. The mansion felt less like a home and more like a labyrinth filled with watchful eyes. Every servant who passed seemed to study her as though they could sense the truth she hid. At breakfast, the long dining table stretched endlessly, polished to perfection. Platters of fruit, bread, and eggs were arranged carefully, though Alexander touched little of it. He sat at the far end, dressed sharply, even in the early hour, his eyes scanning the newspaper with a detached calm. Emily sat quietly, her fingers wrapped around a porcelain teacup. The silence between them was thick, only broken when Alexander lowered the paper and spoke. "You rise early," he observed, his tone neutral. Emily nodded. "It is a habit. There is always work to be done." His gaze lingered on her, as if testing the truth of her words. "Work. That is a word my world rarely hears from women who enter it." He sipped his coffee, his expression unreadable. "They prefer the glitter, the gowns, the jewels. Yet here you are, awake before sunrise." Emily lowered her eyes, her heart uneasy. She could feel his suspicion pressing against her like a weight. He was watching her closely, noticing details, searching for inconsistencies. She forced a small smile. "I have never cared for jewels. They do not keep a roof over your head." Alexander's lips curved, but it was not quite a smile. "You are not what I expected." The words sent a ripple through her chest. Was it a sign of curiosity? Distrust? Perhaps both. She could not afford to let her guard slip. Later that day, Emily wandered into the library, a room that smelled of leather and ink, lined floor to ceiling with books that told the history of the Blackwell family. She ran her hand along the spines, marveling at the collection. For a moment, she forgot her fear and lost herself in the quiet beauty of the place. That was when Alexander appeared in the doorway. "You read?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of surprise. Emily turned, startled. "Yes, it has always been my escape." He stepped into the room, his presence filling the space. "Most women I have known would rather attend a ball than open a book." "Then you have known the wrong women," Emily replied before she could stop herself. Her cheeks flushed instantly, fearing she had spoken too boldly. To her surprise, Alexander did not lash out. Instead, he studied her intently, as though she were a puzzle he could not solve. "You speak as if you have lived a life far from privilege." Emily's breath caught. The truth trembled on her lips, but she forced it down. "Not every life is gilded," she said softly. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Then Alexander turned away, his tone guarded once more. "Perhaps one day, you will tell me what it is you hide." That evening, a storm rolled across the city. Rain lashed against the windows as thunder echoed through the mansion's halls. Emily found herself in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up as she stirred a pot of soup. The staff had been dismissed early, and she could not bear to sit idly while the storm howled outside. Cooking reminded her of home, of her mother's laughter in a cramped kitchen, of simple meals that tasted of love rather than wealth. When Alexander entered the room unexpectedly, Emily froze. He leaned against the doorway, watching her with something almost resembling curiosity. "You cook," he said, his tone not mocking but surprised. Emily steadied herself. "It is nothing extraordinary. Just soup." He stepped closer, inhaling the aroma. "It smells better than anything the chef has prepared in weeks." His voice was low, thoughtful, almost reluctant to admit the compliment. They ate together in the quiet of the storm, the sound of rain filling the silences that once felt unbearable. Emily noticed the way Alexander's shoulders eased, how the sharpness in his gaze softened when he tasted the meal. For the first time, the distance between them felt less like a canyon and more like a fragile bridge. But later that night, as Emily returned to her room, the fragile peace was shattered by the echo of voices. She paused in the hallway, her heart pounding as she heard Alexander speaking in hushed tones to his lawyer. "She is not the same woman I agreed to marry," Alexander said coldly. "There is something different about her, and I intend to find out what." Emily's blood ran cold. She pressed a hand to her mouth, holding back a gasp. He suspected her more than ever. As lightning illuminated the corridor, Emily realized the truth could no longer stay buried forever. The storm outside mirrored the one brewing inside the Blackwell mansion, and she was standing at the heart of it. The storm passed by morning, leaving the Blackwell estate wrapped in damp silence. Emily stood by the tall windows, watching droplets cling to the glass as the gray light of dawn filtered through. Her thoughts circled endlessly around what she had overheard the night before. Alexander's words to his lawyer echoed in her chest like a warning bell. He knew something was wrong. He was watching her more closely than ever. At breakfast, Alexander's eyes met hers across the long table. His expression was cool, guarded, but not entirely hostile. He studied her in a way that made her shift uneasily in her seat. The tension was interrupted only when his cousin, Claudia, swept into the room. Claudia was beautiful, polished, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had grown up in wealth. She kissed Alexander on the cheek, ignoring Emily as though she were invisible. "So this is the new bride," Claudia said finally, her tone sharp under a sweet smile. "You must forgive me for saying so, but you do not look like you belong here." Emily's cheeks warmed, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Perhaps appearances are not the best measure of belonging," she replied softly. Claudia raised an eyebrow, her smirk deepening. Alexander, however, said nothing. His silence stung Emily more than Claudia's words. Later that afternoon, Emily wandered into the garden. The storm had left petals scattered across the stone paths, and the air smelled of earth and rain. She bent to gather fallen roses when she felt eyes on her. Turning, she saw Alexander watching from the terrace. His expression was unreadable, but he did not turn away. For a moment, their gazes held, and something unspoken passed between them. That evening, Alexander found her in the music room. Emily sat at the piano, her fingers hesitantly brushing the keys. She had not played in years, but the familiar notes brought a fragile peace. When she realized he was standing in the doorway, she froze. "Continue," he said, his voice softer than usual. She hesitated, then pressed the keys again, letting a simple melody fill the room. Alexander stepped closer, his eyes fixed on her. When the last note faded, he spoke. "You surprise me at every turn. I expected someone shallow, someone who would cling to luxury. Yet here you are, cooking soup, reading books, and playing piano as if none of this wealth matters to you." Emily's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. "Because it does not. Things fade. People remain." For the first time, Alexander smiled. Small and fleeting, but real. It startled her, and she felt warmth spread through her chest. Days turned into weeks, and though suspicion still lingered, something fragile began to form between them. Emily found herself laughing at Alexander's rare but sharp wit. She noticed the way he softened when she placed a blanket over his shoulders during his coughing fits, or when she left a cup of warm milk on his desk late at night. Yet the outside world pressed in. One evening at a family dinner, whispers filled the table. Claudia leaned forward with a sharp glint in her eyes. "Do you love her, Alexander? Or is this just another arrangement?" The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward them. Emily's breath caught, her heart slamming against her ribs. She prayed Alexander would dismiss it with his usual coldness. But instead, he placed his hand gently over hers on the table. "She is my wife," Alexander said firmly, his gaze steady on her. "And that is all anyone needs to know." Shock rippled through the family. Emily sat frozen, her hand trembling under his, her chest tight with emotion. It was the first time Alexander had publicly defended her, the first time he had spoken as though their union was more than a contract. That night, alone in her room, Emily replayed the moment again and again. His words had been simple, but they carried a weight she could not ignore. For the first time since she had taken her sister's place, she allowed herself to wonder, could this pretend marriage grow into something real? But even as hope flickered, she knew the truth of her deception still hung over them like a shadow. If Alexander ever discovered who she truly was, everything they were building could crumble in an instant. The days that followed the family dinner were quieter, but the silence carried a new weight. Emily felt as though she was walking on fragile glass, every step threatening to reveal the truth she had buried so deeply. Alexander had defended her in front of his family, yet his eyes often lingered on her with a questioning intensity. She could not tell if it was affection, suspicion, or both. One evening, as Emily arranged fresh flowers in a vase, Claudia entered the room with a folded document in her hand. Her smile was sharp, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "You know, dear cousin's wife, secrets never stay hidden forever." She placed the document on the table. "I had a background check run on you. Imagine my surprise when I discovered something unusual." Emily's blood ran cold. Her hands trembled as she reached for the paper. It was not her name printed there, but her sister's. Vanessa's photograph stared back at her, bold letters confirming the identity of the woman Alexander was supposed to have married. Before Emily could react, Alexander entered the room. His eyes moved from Claudia to Emily, then to the document lying open on the table. He picked it up, scanning the contents with a slow, deliberate calm that terrified her more than anger ever could. Finally, he looked at her, his voice low and steady. "So it is true. You are not the woman I married." Tears stung Emily's eyes, but words refused to come. She wanted to explain, to tell him everything, the letter, the choice, the sacrifice, but her throat closed around the truth. Claudia smirked in triumph, but Alexander silenced her with a sharp glance. His focus remained fixed on Emily. "You lied to me. You deceived my family. You deceived me." His words cut deep, each one like a blade. Emily tried to speak, her voice breaking. "I never meant to hurt you. I only wanted to protect my family. My mother, my brother, they needed me to—" But Alexander raised a hand, his expression dark. "Enough. Whatever reasons you had, you built this marriage on a lie." The room spun around her. Emily felt the floor tilt beneath her feet, her heart shattering into pieces. The warmth they had begun to build, the fragile trust, all crumbled in that single moment. Without another word, Alexander turned and walked away, leaving her standing in silence, her tears falling unchecked. That night, Emily sat alone in her room, clutching the letter her sister had written, the same letter that had started it all. She whispered into the darkness, her voice breaking. "What have I done?" For the first time since she had stepped into Vanessa's place, Emily felt not only the weight of her lie but also the unbearable ache of losing the man she had never meant to love. The days after the truth came out were heavy with silence. Emily moved through the mansion like a shadow, her footsteps soft, her eyes downcast. She no longer tried to meet Alexander's gaze, because when she did, all she saw was disappointment and betrayal. The fragile bond that had begun to grow between them was shattered, replaced by a wall of cold distance. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the estate, Alexander stood alone in his study. Papers lay scattered across the desk, contracts and financial documents that spoke of power and wealth, but none of it could silence the storm in his chest. He replayed every moment with Emily, her quiet kindness, her patience, her unexpected warmth, and now every memory was stained with doubt. Yet no matter how much anger he carried, another truth gnawed at him. The affection he felt had been real. His lawyer arrived with news of Claudia pressing to annul the marriage and strip Emily of any claim to the Blackwell fortune. "It is the logical move," the lawyer advised. "Remove her, and the family reputation will be safe." Alexander's jaw tightened. Safe? Or convenient for those waiting like vultures to divide what is mine? His voice was sharp, filled with defiance. He dismissed the lawyer, his mind racing. Meanwhile, Emily sat in her room, with her mother's photograph clutched in her hands. She whispered through tears, "I only wanted to protect us. I never meant for this to happen." She thought of leaving, of ending the deception once and for all. But her heart ached at the thought of walking away without making things right. That night, Alexander found her in the hallway. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned with intensity. "Emily," he said firmly, "why did you do it? Why did you take your sister's place?" Her lips trembled, but she stood tall, her voice raw. "Because my family needed me. Because my sister ran, and I could not watch everything collapse. I lied, yes, but I stayed. Every day, I stayed." For the first time in days, Alexander did not look at her with only anger. There was still hurt, but beneath it was a glimmer of something else. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Then you must decide now. Will you run like she did, or will you fight for the truth, for us, even if everything is against you?" Emily's chest tightened. She knew this was no longer about contracts or appearances. It was about choices, about courage, about love born in the unlikeliest of places. And in that moment, she vowed silently. She would not run. The following week brought with it the weight of confrontation. Alexander called for a family gathering in the Grand Hall, a place where portraits of stern ancestors seemed to watch every move. The air was thick with expectation. Claudia arrived first, dressed in elegance, her eyes sharp with victory. Other relatives whispered among themselves, certain that Alexander would cast Emily out. Emily stood at Alexander's side, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her heart pounded, but she held her ground. She had promised herself she would not run. Claudia's voice rang out, dripping with scorn. "It is time to end this charade, cousin. She deceived you, and she deceived all of us. Annul the marriage, and restore dignity to the Blackwell name." Alexander rose from his chair slowly, his presence commanding silence. His gaze swept across the room before landing on Claudia. "Dignity?" he repeated coldly. "What you seek is not dignity. It is control." Murmurs rippled through the family. Claudia stiffened, but Alexander pressed on. "Yes, Emily deceived me." She stood where her sister should have stood. But while her sister ran, Emily remained. When I was weak, when I was ill, she stayed. And she has shown me more loyalty than anyone in this room. Emily's eyes burned with tears she fought to hold back. The family gasped at his words, shock etched across their faces. Claudia sneered, her mask slipping. "So you would throw away everything for her? You would risk the Blackwell fortune for a woman who lied?" Alexander's voice thundered with authority. "I would rather risk fortune than betray my own heart." He reached for Emily's hand, gripping it firmly before the family's eyes. "This is my wife. Not by arrangement, not by convenience, by choice." The hall fell silent. For the first time, Alexander had spoken not as the distant, cold millionaire, but as a man claiming the woman he loved. The tension cracked, and Emily felt her heart tremble under the weight of his words. Claudia's face twisted with fury, but she could not fight him. The family had witnessed his declaration. The matter was settled. That night, when the house grew quiet, Alexander returned to Emily's side. His illness had worsened, and every breath came with effort, but his eyes held fire. "I may not have much time," he whispered, his voice strained, "but whatever time I do have, I want it with you." Emily pressed her trembling hand to his cheek, tears finally spilling free. "Then we will face it together. No matter how long, no matter how hard." And in that fragile, aching moment, love was no longer hidden. It was spoken, real, and unbreakable. The declaration Alexander made in front of his family changed everything. From that night forward, no one dared question Emily's place at his side. Yet behind the closed doors of the mansion, the reality of his failing health could not be ignored. Each day, Alexander grew weaker, his once powerful frame slowed by illness. But instead of pulling away, Emily drew closer. She was no longer just the woman who had stepped into her sister's place. She became his anchor, his companion, and the only person who brought light into the dark halls of the Blackwell estate. In the mornings, Emily would sit by his bedside, reading aloud from the books she discovered in the vast library. Alexander listened quietly, sometimes with his eyes closed, sometimes watching her intently, as if her voice was the only medicine he trusted. At noon, when the weight of fatigue overcame him, Emily would make sure he rested, drawing the curtains to soften the sunlight, adjusting pillows to ease his breathing. At night, she prepared simple meals herself, meals that reminded him of the warmth of home instead of the extravagance of wealth. One evening, as she placed a bowl of warm stew before him, Alexander chuckled softly, though the sound was hoarse. "You are unlike anyone I have ever known. Most would leave a man like me to waste away in silence, yet you stay." Emily met his gaze, her voice steady though her heart trembled. "Because you are worth staying for." "Oh," he said nothing in return, but the look in his eyes told her more than words could. Outside the mansion, whispers of scandal faded as time passed. The press lost interest, and the relatives who once plotted against her withdrew into silence. Without the support of Alexander, their influence dwindled. Claudia, once so confident, rarely showed her face anymore. Justice had been dealt not through courts or contracts, but through truth and loyalty revealed in time. Emily's world, however, was not one of luxury. She insisted on helping the staff with small tasks, often sweeping through the garden or arranging fresh flowers in the hall. Her hands bore the marks of labor, but she cherished them. They reminded her of who she was, of the strength she carried long before the Blackwell name was tied to hers. Alexander would often watch from the terrace, silently amused and quietly touched by her refusal to let wealth change her spirit. Slowly, with care and medical treatment, Alexander's health began to stabilize. He was no longer the dying man spoken of in hushed tones. Though still fragile, he regained strength little by little, enough to walk the gardens with Emily at his side. Those moments became their sanctuary. Emily would point out the blooming roses, or share stories from her childhood, while Alexander listened with a faint smile that grew more genuine with each passing day. One afternoon, as the golden light of sunset bathed the garden, Emily paused to adjust the blanket around his shoulders. He caught her hand in his grip warm and sure. "You have given me a reason to fight," he murmured. "Before you, I was waiting for the end. Now, I look forward to tomorrow." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, but she smiled through them. "Then tomorrow is ours. We will face it together." The mansion no longer felt like a cage of wealth and secrets. It became a home filled with quiet moments of care, laughter, and simple joys. Their days were not grand or extravagant, but they were real. And for Emily and Alexander, that truth was more precious than any fortune. Though shadows of the past lingered, though uncertainty still lay ahead, hope had taken root in both their hearts. It was hope built not on deception, but on devotion. Hope that tomorrow would not be the end, but the beginning of a life they had chosen together. Months passed, and with them came change neither Emily nor Alexander could have imagined on the day she first walked down the aisle in her sister's place. What had begun as a marriage built on deception had transformed into a bond rooted in loyalty, sacrifice, and love. The mansion no longer echoed with suspicion and whispers, but with the warmth of a life they were building together. Alexander's health, though still delicate, continued to improve. The man who had once been spoken of as dying now walked the gardens with measured strength, his hand always clasped around Emily's. Doctors marveled at his progress, but Emily believed the truth was simpler. Love had given him the will to live. One crisp spring morning, Alexander asked Emily to meet him in the grand hall. The chandeliers glittered above them, and the air carried the scent of blooming roses from the garden. Emily arrived, puzzled, until she saw him standing at the end of the aisle. He wore a tailored suit, his posture proud, though not without effort, and beside him stood a minister. Confusion and wonder filled Emily's eyes. "What is this?" she whispered. Alexander's voice carried with quiet strength. "The first time we stood here, our vows were spoken under a lie. Today, I want us to stand here again, with nothing but truth between us." Tears blurred her vision as realization dawned. This was not a contract. This was not an arrangement. This was a wedding born of choice. The staff gathered discreetly, their faces glowing with joy as Emily walked forward, her simple dress brushing the floor. There were no jewels, no guests to gossip, no cameras flashing. Only sincerity. Only two hearts bound by everything they had endured. When the minister spoke, Alexander's hand tightened around hers. His voice was steady as he repeated the vows, each word infused with meaning. I take you, Emily, not because of obligation, not because of family, but because I cannot imagine my life without you. Emily's tears fell freely as she answered, her voice trembling but sure. And I take you, Alexander, not because of wealth, not because of status, but because you are the man I choose, today and always. The moment they sealed their vows with a kiss, applause broke softly around them, not from an audience of hundreds, but from the small circle of people who had witnessed their journey. Later, as the sun set in shades of gold and crimson, Alexander and Emily walked hand in hand through the gardens. The world beyond the gates might still whisper about wealth and scandal, but within those walls, nothing mattered except the truth they had claimed. Emily glanced at the simple band on her finger, the same ring that had once symbolized deception. Now, it gleamed as a promise of love freely given, a love that had endured lies, betrayal, and despair, and had emerged stronger. Alexander paused, looking at her with a smile that reached his eyes. You saved me, he said softly. Emily shook her head, resting her forehead against his. No, we saved each other. And with that, the story that began as a false vow ended with a true one, not in shadows and fear, but in light, hope, and the certainty of a love that would last a lifetime.